Hello, friends, and welcome to the Diabetes Pro Tip series from the Juicebox Podcast. These episodes have been remastered for better sound quality by Rob at Wrong Way Recording. When you need it done right, you choose Wrong Way. WrongWayRecording.com. Initially imagined by me as a 10-part series, the Diabetes Pro Tip series has grown to 26 episodes. These episodes now exist in your audio player between episode 1000 and episode 1025. They are also available online at diabetesprotip.com and juiceboxpodcast.com. This series features myself and Jennifer Smith. Jenny is a CDE and a Type 1 for over 35 years. This series was my attempt to bring together the management ideas found within the podcast in a way that would make it digestible and revisitable. It has been so incredibly popular that these 26 episodes are responsible for well over 500,000 downloads within the Juicebox Podcast. While you're listening, please remember that nothing you hear on the Juicebox Podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. Always consult a physician before making any changes to your healthcare plan or becoming bold with insulin. This episode of the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by Ascensia Diabetes, makers of the Contour Next Gen blood glucose meter. And they have an amazing offer for you. Right now, at my link only, contournext.com/juicebox free meter, you can get an absolutely free Contour Next Gen starter kit. That's contournext.com/juicebox free meter. While supplies last, U.S. residents only. The Remastered Diabetes Pro Tip series from the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by Touched by Type 1. See all of the good work they're doing for people living with Type 1 diabetes at touchedbytype1.org and on their Instagram and Facebook pages. This show is sponsored today by the glucagon that my daughter carries, Gvoke HypoPen. Find out more at gvokeglucagon.com/juicebox. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 237 of the Juicebox Podcast. Today's episode, you know by the title, is with your favorite guest, Jenny Smith. Jenny and I are here today to add an 11th entry into my Diabetes Pro Tip series. Please don't let the fact that this is the 11th episode in this series make you think basal rate testing, probably not that important. If it was, they would have moved it up sooner. Not even close. Having your basal insulin correct is the core of everything you're doing with insulin. You can't trust that your bolus was right or wrong. You can't understand why you got low or why you got high. When your basal insulin isn't correct, everything you see coming back to you from your blood sugar experiences, from your glucose monitors, from your meter testing, none of it is actionable. None of it is valuable if your basal isn't right. Every time I speak with someone privately, we start with basal insulin. Doesn't matter if you're pumping or injecting, and most people's basal insulin is significantly incorrect. If you're seeing blood sugars that you don't understand, it's easy to see a low blood sugar and think that means less basal. But that's not always the case. At the end of this episode, I believe you're going to have a firmer grasp of what basal insulin is, how to make adjustments to it, and why it's so important. You really need to listen to this one. This is where it all starts. A funny thing happened the other day. I felt like we did such a great job of outlining everything that everyone would need to know. And I was so comfortable with it that I started supporting the podcast episodes with like social media posts like, hey, don't forget how important your basal insulin is. And the amount of notes that I got that were like, hey, you didn't do an episode specifically about setting up your basal rates. And I was like, I didn't. I felt like we covered it all with what we talked about, but okay, if you want to so let's add one that's about setting up your basal testing and getting it right. And I was like, all right, well, we'll definitely do that. If the people are asking for it, Jenny, then we have to deliver.
That's right.
That's what I'm thinking.
That's what we're thinking. Fabulous.
So I would like to do that. Now, here's how I imagine this. And I'm recording already, so this will probably all end up in the episode. I'm assuming there's a super specific way, because I remember being taught it in the doctor's office. Very specific. Don't eat food for this much time. Make sure this whole thing, and this is what your basal rate's going to be. Now, There are times when I think that's antiquated in as much as if you have a CGM, you may be able to figure out your basal more quickly. But I'll cover that when we get to my less technical way of doing it. But I really do want to start with what is the accepted medical process for figuring out what your basal insulin should be. Check out Dancing for Diabetes at dancingfordiabetes.com. That's dancing, the number 4, diabetes.com. You can also find them on Facebook and Instagram. Fantastic organization. You should check them out at the very least. Get involved if you like what you see. What is the accepted medical process for figuring out what your basal insulin should be? Go crazy, Jenny, because I feel like you're going to get to talk a lot right now.
Well, the accepted medical way to do it can also vary. You know, I've heard a lot of different, but I've also heard enough similarities. I mean, I guess our medical way to do it within integrated, when we start working with somebody brand new, that's a first and foremost question. Have you verified that your basals are working well? And basal evaluation can also be done using injected basal insulin as well. Okay. Not in the same way or as extensively as a pumped basal rate, right? But you can evaluate to see whether or not your basal injected insulin is working pretty solidly too.
Okay.
So both of them can be looked at. As far as pumping, we always start with an overnight evaluation. And the reason for doing overnight testing first is, one, majority of people, unless you're a shift worker or an overnight truck driver or something, most people are sleeping in that overnight time period. Right. So there's no eating, no exercising, there's no food going in anyway. It's like one of the easiest times of day to actually get a basal test in. Okay?
I agree.
The biggest thing heading into any basal test is that there isn't any food that's going to be impacting in that basal time period, and there's no lingering impact of your bolus. So for an overnight test, we aim to say, have your dinner and bolus by 6 p.m. Because by 10 p.m., when most people are going to bed, give or take, depending on if you're a little kid or an adult or whatever, by 10 p.m., that bolus itself and 99% of that food impact should be gone by 10 p.m. In, out, kind of the bell curve of effect, right? So from 10 p.m. overnight and into your normal waking time, then we get a true look at what is basal doing to hold things steady. Now, the other variables, since we had an episode about variables too, right?
I did.
That comes into play with testing. You know, if you are in those couple of days before your period is starting, if you have a nasty cold, if you have a lot of exercise because of training or practice or something, you don't want a basal test on an overnight when any of those pieces are happening. Right?
You know what I wonder too is I'm starting to believe that there's a different basal rate that my daughter needs depending on her site. So I think there's a leg basal rate for her, and I think there's a belly basal rate for her.
That's actually funny. When I use my upper butt for my Omnipods, prior to looping with a Medtronic pump, I noticed that on my butt, I need about 10% more basal insulin. And so I set up a basal profile that I call butt. Can I say that on butt?
You could definitely say butt, yeah.
I called it butt, and I had it 10% higher than my standard tested basal rate, right? That ran on my other normal sites, which seemed to work the same. So you're not crazy in thinking that it could be the case. And it's something I bring up with people too, especially those who use Omnipod, which you can wear it in a lot of different places compared to conventional tubed pumps, right? Yeah. So overnight, the goal of basal testing then is to have fair stability, and not like this entirely flat line, but the goal is to not have more variance than about 20 to 30 points up or down from where your finger stick value at 10 p.m. is. And the goal at 10 p.m., once that bolus from dinner and the dinner food is pretty much gone, 10 p.m., your blood sugar, you're aiming for it to be somewhere between 80 and 250. I know that looks like a broad range, right?
Right.
And you're thinking, well, gosh, if it was like 150, I'd totally correct that at bedtime because I don't want to sit at night all night at bedtime, 150. You let it lie. You don't touch it. You don't take corrective. You just let it sit. So if you go to bed at 188, you leave it alone because the basal's job is to not correct that. The basal's job is to hold you pretty steady. If you're not going to have more than a 20 to 30 point variance up or down from that, that means all night long, you shouldn't really go more than like a little bit above 200 or maybe down to like the 150s if you started at like 188.
And if you accomplish that, then you imagine that the basal's pretty steady.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. If you accomplish that with little variance, but not a lot, and you wake up, let's say at 169, awesome. Your basal, we would hold it check marked off in our box of records as stable, tested. It's good. Let's move on to the next testing period. Now, let's say your basal does show that it's not right. Let's say that 10 p.m., 188 blood sugar, but by 1 a.m., you're starting to see a drift up. That's significant. And by 2 or 3 o'clock, you're like 50 or 60 points higher than you went to bed at. Absolutely, there's something wrong. Now, where do you adjust? That's the next big question. People are like, well, I was high at 2 o'clock, so I changed my basal at 2 o'clock so that it wouldn't be high anymore.
Right.
It's kind of missing the boat, right?
Right.
Because where you really want to adjust the basal is about 1 to 2 hours prior to the drift to being too high or too low starts.
Okay.
So if you're too high by 2 a.m., you probably need a basal adjustment at least by 1 a.m. or maybe midnight that's higher so that you don't have the drift up in the next 2 hours.
Yeah. And and for people listening that get confused by that, if you think about pre-bolusing, you put insulin and it doesn't begin working for a certain amount of time, either does basal insulin, and you're using much less of it. So to get a real impact from it could take some time for it to build up its efficacy, I guess, right? And then be able to hold you stable. Okay.
Correct. Yep. So that circulating insulin level, it's a great description. It needs some time to bump up or bump down to the rate that's going to be then effective an hour to 2 hours from now at that rate.
It's the same reason why when we tell somebody if your blood sugar is super stable at 70 and it's been like that for hours and you haven't had food or insulin and you want to try to bring it up by doing a temp down, you can. But if your blood sugar is falling at 70, shutting off your basal is not going to do anything to affect what's happening right now. Correct. You'll make your blood sugar high 2 hours later, right after your seizure.
Right. Right. Exactly. Right. Yeah. Or after you had, 30 grams of a juice box or whatever.
Right.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So it's same thing, if you're drifting down, you adjust the basal down a little bit, still in the same time frame, 1 to 2 hours prior to that drift starting so that you don't get too low later.
Right.
Now, by how much? I mean, again, this is where it does vary a bit, but usually, if the drift up is somewhere between like 30 to maybe 60 points higher or lower than you want to be within that time period, an adjustment by 0.05 to the basal rate could be enough to make a change so that you're not drifting up or down.
Yeah.
If it's more significant drift and you're really rising like 100 points, you started at 188 and by 2 a.m. you're at 280. That's a pretty big change.
Yeah.
And again, we would probably adjust the basal at least by 0.1, maybe even 0.15, depending.
What's interesting is that I know this isn't like any kind of hard and fast rule, or it is, and I've found it by mistake, but I talk to a lot of people with kids, younger children. And it seems to me that a rule of thumb is 0.1 per 10 pounds of body weight with kids. I don't know if that ends up working for adults or not, but the more people I talk to, the more I see like that's what makes sense. And I don't know if it's an anomaly for me, but when you have somebody on a phone call with you, which telling you something about themselves, and it's like, I'm doing this and it's not working and blah, blah, blah. And you need somewhere to start. Like, it doesn't, you know what I mean? You need somewhere to start. And I always ask like, well, how much do they weigh? And most of the time it bears out. But then recently I spoke to somebody, it wasn't even close. It didn't matter. The weight was unimportant. That child just did not use the insulin the same way.
Right.
I think of basil in a completely odd way. I think of it like volume, right? Like on a stereo. And I just think if you can't hear it, or if the basil's not working, turn it up. And if it's too loud, turn it down. And because Arden's using, a Dexcom G6, I just turn it up until she gets where I want her to be, and then I dial it back a little bit. Is that a bad thing? Am I doing that wrong? Is that irresponsible? Which, by the way, in the last 10 years has become a word again. I don't know if you know that. Irresponsible. There was time grammar people would be like, that's not a word. You can't say that. And all of a sudden it's become acceptable in like the last half a decade or so. So now I feel comfortable to speak improperly again. So irresponsible. Is it irresponsible?
Irresponsible. Well, I actually use that word with my 6.5-year-old all the time. So I guess I've been using it more appropriately now than I thought. Yes. Like, that is irresponsible to do that. Do not do that, so no.
Anyway, I
don't think that that's irresponsible.
Okay.
I mean, you're doing again in the topic of basal specific adjustment. If you're talking about temporary basal adjustment, we do that a lot to dial it up, to dial it back, to kind of, and that's also the concept of looping, right?
Right.
Is that the system works according to what it sees happening to the blood sugar and the insulin that's active and the food that's active, and it may dial things up and it may dial things back. So that's, definitely not irresponsible. When we're talking about setting true basal, though, we really want to make sure that we set the basal rate itself in the profile the right way. And you can dial it up. If you want to be truly bold with insulin, you may want to dial it up a little bit more than you think you may need. Mm-hmm. Do another basal test. And then if it doesn't work quite well because now you're ending up lower than you wanted, great. Just dial it back a little bit in the adjustment that you made. But at least it'll be a better picture, overall. And you can always test over and over again. Right. Most people hate basal testing, myself included.
Yeah. No, well, listen, I remember getting the sheet of paper handed to me when Arden was 2. And they're like, the first thing we're going to want to do is basal test. And I looked at the sheet and I'm like, well, I'm not doing any of this, but okay. And, looking back, I really should have done it. Especially back then when there was no CGM and, none of that stuff. And I really should have done it. But no food being digested, no active insulin. Like, how am I going to get like a little kid not to eat for 5 or 6 hours? And I did eventually figure out that overnight was the place to begin. And you can, to some degree, infer the daytime from the nighttime. Meaning, if it takes a unit an hour overnight, you're probably not 5 units an hour during the day. You're probably somewhere near that unit, right?
Right.
And it could be, it could be significant. Right now, Arden is more like a unit overnight and more like 2 units during the day.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Mm-hmm. So but that also will go back and forth. It just changes. I will say this, because you alluded to it earlier and you were just talking about the idea of basal testing. Like, I know a lot of you don't want your blood sugar to be 180 or 200 overnight, but for this test, maybe that's what has to be. I'm really coming to realize that an incredibly flat line, one that's 85 for 24 hours a day, is really not reasonable. It's doable, right? And sometimes you'll get it. And maybe you'll get it for days in a row if you're really dialed in. But you can't be upset if a blood sugar goes to 160 for 45 minutes and comes back again.
Right.
It just, my blood sugar goes to 160. Like, if I sit down and ate a plate of pancakes today, my blood sugar is going to be 160, probably for a couple of hours. Now, different situation, right? And I don't have the other impacts of type 1 diabetes like people with type 1 do. And I get wanting to limit it. But everything we've talked about on this podcast for the last number of years, I've seen it intersect with Arden becoming an adult. And so do I think you can keep a 90 blood sugar forever if your kid hasn't hit puberty yet? I bet you can, right? I think it's super easy. I think that when you get to puberty, I don't think you should beat yourself up if that doesn't happen. And I can still do it most times. You know what I mean? Like, don't get me wrong. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. Like, it doesn't seem as important to me. It almost seems like a video game now when I step back and I watch people online do it, for instance. And they're like, look at this graph. And I'm like, that's amazing. And then there's part of me that wants to say, show it to me 10 days in a row, and then I'll get excited, right? Like, don't just show me one in the middle of May and go, hey, look what I did here. And that's why, you know, on my blog, I try to put things up that are like, look how wrong everything went today. Arden's A1C still under 6, you know? I don't know. I want you guys to realize that we don't want spikes. When we get them, we want to bring them back down again. But if they happen, you cannot run around like you've lost some, you know, game that's attached to your mortality somehow. You know, if your blood sugar is always 200, yes. But, you know, if it jumps once or twice, come on, like, ease up a little bit. Okay.
Right.
So how reasonable is it that once I basal test, I'm actually going to know what my basal rates are? The Remastered Diabetes Pro Tip series is sponsored by Ascensia Diabetes, makers of the Contour Next Gen Blood Glucose Meter, and they have a unique offer just for listeners of the Juicebox Podcast. If you're new to Contour, you can get a free Contour Next Gen starter kit by visiting this special link, contournext.com/juicebox free meter. When you use my link, you're going to get the same accurate meter that my daughter carries. contournext.com/juicebox free meter. Head there right now and get yourself the starter kit. This free kit includes the Contour Next Gen meter, 10 test strips, 10 lancets, a lancing device, control solution, and a carry case. But most importantly, it includes an incredibly accurate and easy to use blood glucose meter. This Contour meter has a bright light for nighttime viewing, an easy to read screen. It fits well in your hand and features second chance sampling, which can help you to avoid wasting strips. Every one of you has a blood glucose meter. You deserve an accurate one. contournext.com/juicebox free meter to get your absolutely free Contour Next Gen starter kit sent right to your door. When it's time to get more strips, you can use my link and save time and money buying your Contour Next products from the convenience of your home. It's completely possible that you will pay less out of pocket in cash for your Contour strips than you're paying now through your insurance. contournext.com/juicebox free meter. Go get yourself a free starter kit. While supplies last, U.S. residents only. Touched by Type 1 has a wide array of resources and programs for people living with Type 1 diabetes. When you visit touchedbytype1.org, go up to the top of the page where it says Programs. There you're going to see all of the terrific things that Touched by Type 1 is doing. And I mean, it's a lot. Type 1 at school, the D-Box program, Golfing for Diabetes, Dancing for Diabetes, which is a terrific program. You just click on that to check that out. Bowl for a Cause, their awareness campaigns, and the annual conference that I've spoken at a number of years in a row. It's just amazing, just like Touched by Type 1. Touchedbytype1.org, or find them on Facebook and Instagram. Links in the show notes. Links at juiceboxpodcast.com to Touched by Type 1 and the other great sponsors that are supporting the remastering of the Diabetes Pro Tip series. Touchedbytype1.org. When you have diabetes and use insulin, low blood sugar can happen when you don't expect it. Gvoke HypoPen is a ready-to-use glucagon option that can treat very low blood sugar in adults and kids with diabetes ages 2 and above. Find out more. Go to gvokeglucagon.com/juicebox. Gvoke shouldn't be used in patients with pheochromocytoma or insulinoma. Visit gvokeglucagon.com/risk. Are there times I basal test and then I don't have any better of an answer?
There might be, especially if, like I said before, if you're doing some basal testing and there are variables at play that you didn't really think to pay attention to within that time period, then absolutely, though that basal test could be not very purposeful. It could be kind of null and void. And this is something I encounter a lot with women, and something I bring up when I work with them to begin with in a first visit is, one, you said you've done basal testing, but two, do you know your cycle impact if you have one? Mm-hmm. And two, did you basal test in that sweet spot of like 2 to maybe 3 weeks, whether women are on birth control or not? There's sort of like this 2 to 3 weeks of sweet kind of place of management without significant hormone impact. And that's where basal testing needs to happen. It needs to happen without the impact of the pre-cycle or ovulation hormones kind of coming into play. So if you haven't basal tested in those sweet spots, you can be completely wrong what's happening and what your basal needs are. Once you do have that sweet spot put into play, then the other, and this is an important piece that a lot of people ask about too, is great. So then I need to test in these other times. Well, not really. What we find is that women mostly need like a 25 to maybe 40% increase in a hormone specific time period of the month. If you know that, what you can do is use a temp basal, see how well does this work. And what you can do, because the time periods during the day that your basal goes up or down, physiologically, those times will remain pretty stable. Those shouldn't need to change. It may be that you just need 25% more between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m., right?
Okay.
So you can plug that into a basal profile, set it, and turn it on or enable it when you need to. But those time periods of the day, they stay pretty stable. Once you've designated, my basal needs go up at 2 a.m., they shift down again at 8 a.m. They're pretty stable until 4 or 5 p.m. They might go up or down again. Another piece for basal testing is that most people, again, your diabetes may vary, but most people most people have one valley and one peak to their basal during the day. Okay. So let's say they start midnight at 0.6. It might go up to 0.8 by 2 or 3 a.m. Maybe it goes down around 8 a.m., 9 a.m. to like 0.6 again. And then through the day, it stays kind of lower. And then it may shift back up into the evening time. Okay. So you kind of had one dip and one rise through the course of a 24-hour time period. Again, that's most people, not everyone. Most people also have about 3 to 5 basal rates through the course of the day, or basal time periods. So, midnight until 6 a.m., 6 a.m. until 4 p.m., 4 p.m. to 9 p.m., 9 p.m. to midnight. Those time blocks, most people have about 3 to 5 different segments of rate need through the course of a day.
Yeah, and you have to stay flexible too. You can't just say to yourself, look, I've set this basal rate. It starts at 3 p.m. and it ends at 7 p.m. and it always works. And then Thursday comes and at 5 o'clock, your blood sugar starts to drift up and it won't stop drifting up. You can't lock yourself into that doesn't make sense because my basal always works. It's not working now. And the reasons, and we talk about this throughout the years of the podcast, but the reasons are almost unimportant in the moment. The truth is your blood sugar. Yeah, right. You need more insulin, use more insulin. And I've begun to start saying privately that the diabetes, your blood sugar, it's requiring more of you. So give it to it. It's telling you something. Your blood sugar going up is your body saying, hey, I don't have enough insulin. Don't wonder why, just believe it. You know what I mean? Like there's no reason to, I don't know. If you came up to an intersection and there was a cop standing there with his hand up and says, don't go around the corner, there's a guy with a gun there. Just believe the cop and don't go around the corner. There's no reason for you to peek your head around the building and go, oh my God, there is a guy shooting there. Just take his word for it and walk around the block. And
move away.
Right. So when your diabetes is telling you, hey, I don't have enough insulin, just believe it and give it more insulin. I got this beautiful note this morning from someone who said they were listening to the last episode. And she said, I think she called it like a bat in the head moment where she was just like, oh my God, I'm an idiot. Why am I not using more insulin? Running around all day looking at her blood sugar going, what's wrong? And she said, we must have said something on the podcast. And she just was like, oh, but sometimes that happens. Cause you get so narrow focused on the things that are supposed to be happening that you can't break away from them for a second and look at actually what's going on. Listen, people, this is good life advice too. If you're fighting with a spouse or a girlfriend, right? and you're saying to yourself, I have the best intentions here. Why is she upset? It doesn't matter. She is, so you're doing something wrong. Forget figuring out what it is. You're wrong. Stop. Or,
you're wrong.
That's it.
Yeah.
I've given you a number of ways to think about this now. When your blood sugar is going up, give yourself more insulin. As a matter of fact, Jenny, my next t-shirt is going to say more insulin. That's the next t-shirt I'm going to print if I can ever figure out how to print t-shirts.
Can I have one then?
Absolutely. Jenny deserves a t-shirt. All right. Everybody's always like telling me it's like so easy to print t-shirts. How can you not figure it out? It's like, I'm very busy. Leave me alone. But I'm trying. Anyway.
Yeah. But I think that's also a really good point, Scott, because if this is where you could also say, is it a trend now? Like you said, 5 p.m., my blood sugar is going up. I don't know why. Right. I don't have any active food. I don't have any active insulin. It shouldn't be going up. I felt like things were pretty good up until today. Great. Well, you know what? Tomorrow, if it's happening again, the next day, if it's happening again, something shifted. Why? Yes. Again, don't play with the why. I mean, you can go back and evaluate and look at some things and whatever. But in the moment, you say, you know what? It looks like my blood sugar is starting to go up by 4:30, 5 o'clock every day, and I'm high by 6 o'clock, and I keep adjusting and correcting. Don't do that.
Right.
Adjust it. Make an adjustment and go forward. And then, you know what? If it shifts back down, great. If a couple of days you're ending up low, then you shift it back down again.
Yeah, see, you're highlighting something that I've never understood when people say to me, how many days till I think it's a trend and I should change? And I'm always like, what? Like by the time you suss it out 3 days later, it might go back again. Now you've given away 3 days of your blood sugar at that level.
Right.
Yeah, just learn. Don't ask your wife, are you really going to wear those pants? Like, she doesn't like it when you say that to her, right? Like, so stop and don't do it again. Like,
right.
My blood sugar went up at 5 o'clock. I did something about it. Tomorrow it went up at 5 o'clock. I did something about it. The next day, I'm not even letting us get to 5 o'clock, right? I'm just going to decide, I'm going to expect that what I know is going to happen, and I'm going to deal with it ahead of time. And if it happens to not go that way, well, then I can dial it back again.
Right.
Not
Absolutely.
a big deal. But it's so much easier to ramp up your insulin and bring it back than it is to
sooner than later
get a high blood sugar. And
that's where many times doctors will say, hey, follow a trend over the course of a week. Well, that's 5 to 7 days then that you have chunked out higher or potentially lower than you want blood sugars because you're trying to find a trend. I mean, in pregnancy with the women that I work with, we say 2 days of a trend, we're making an adjustment. Mm-hmm. And you know what? If we need to dial it back again for whatever reason, we will. But we're not leaving things travel higher or lower for more than that time period. We will adjust and then we'll adjust again.
And for all of you who have ever said to me, yeah, I'm going to handle that the next time I go to my doctor 3 months from now, you make my brain hurt when you say things like that. Okay, just please do not wait 3 months to address something. Even I just yesterday, had a person who won a giveaway that I did with Dancing for Diabetes, and we had a phone call together.
Nice.
And this person, it was great. A person in their 60s who decided to get a CGM and a pump, and is very excited for themselves. And then she said, I have a doctor's appointment in July. And I said, no, don't wait till July. I said, write an email right now. Hey doc, guess what? I'm getting a Dexcom G6 and I'm getting an Omnipod. Go ahead and send those prescriptions in for me. I want to do that right now. And when I'm excited to come to you in July, and I'm going to bring my new stuff with me, and you can show me how to do all of it. And I said, and if you never make it there to show her, maybe you figure it out on YouTube or somewhere, whatever. And, but, or maybe they'll send a trainer to your house. I think that is the appropriate thing to say. Right. And, yes. but I was like, don't wait till July. I said, because July is 6 weeks from now. 6 weeks from now, you're going to tell the doctor what you want. They're going to wait a week because people don't do things right away for you. They're going to send in their prescriptions for you. Then you're not going to get this pump for 6 months if you do that. I'm like, start today. Go right now. Be proactive.
Yes. With technology the way that it is, and electronic medical records and things like My Chart and things that you can send back and forth, there is no reason to not communicate with a doctor. And you know what? If you don't get a response from them within 24 hours, you call the office and you ask to talk to their nurse. And you say, this needs to get to the doctor, it needs to be signed, it needs to be taken care of.
Arden's endocrinologist and I have been adjusting her Synthroid. Arden is taking Synthroid and Cytomel now, and we've been making adjustments by email. But what's taking And it's still taking a long time to get it straight. Imagine if I only made the adjustment every 3 months when I saw her. Arden would be like a puddle on the ground. When Arden doesn't have enough Synthroid, she can't pick her head up off of the ground. She just slumps over and she's like, bleh. Her blood pressure gets incredibly low. And she looks like she's dying the whole time. And so once she has more Synthroid, she sits right back up again. It's literally like grabbing a marionette by its strings when she has enough Synthroid. But if I had to only make adjustments to her medication quarterly, it might take us 2 years to get it right. And we might never, because she's growing and gaining weight throughout that time.
And think of her education in this time period too. What would she be getting out of her classes and the ability to perform and any athletics that she likes to do and the enjoyment of fun with friends and everything? I mean, that puts a major cramp in any age, whether you're a child or an adult trying to perform in work or whatever.
Yes.
I mean, any adjustment, it needs to be addressed in the here and now, not waiting 3 months to say, oh, well, doctor, you can see my C is such and such high. Well, I've been having a lot higher blood sugars. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had an appointment, so I waited until I came in. Don't do that.
Yeah. No, right. Jenny, if you were standing out front of your house and you had your garden hose in your hand and your porch caught on fire, would you stand there with the hose saying, oh, the fire company will be here soon? I don't need to squirt the hose at this porch. Why would I do that? The fireman's coming. He's a professional. I'll let him handle it. Just hold the hose up.
Can't I get started with my hose?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Why don't I just see what I can get accomplished here? All right. So bringing this all back to your basal insulin, because no one thinks about their basal insulin with nearly the importance that it is. I spent the first 10 minutes of a conversation the other day explaining to a person what it was. And after I explained it, I had to explain it again. And so... And you can still hear people go, so that's the Levemir? Like people on MDI, they're like, so, and I get it, like they're newly diagnosed maybe sometimes, or they never got a firm explanation. But we treat basal insulin like it's not important, and it's everything. It's so much more important. Like if we say it all the time, everything starts at basal. If basal's not right, nothing else works coming off of it.
Right. Well, and so many people think that basal's job is to bring blood sugar down. Right? So many people, I mean, people I've worked with who've had diabetes long-term, who've come in and, I look at their records to begin with and they're confused and annoyed that their basal insulin isn't letting them wake up at a target blood sugar. I just stay high all night long. Well, you're starting the night high. So time chunks of the day, usually where you are now, it's because the hours ahead of that, something isn't right.
Yeah.
It's not the here and now. It's the what happened before this that got you here. So let's look. I wanted my basal it's here and here and here, and it should be bringing me down. No, that's not basal's job.
Right.
Basal's job is to hold you steady. If you didn't eat all day long, you shouldn't have much variance.
Diabetes is like a time travel movie. I've come to think of it this way, right? Like whatever's happening to you in the moment when the camera's pointed at you has nothing to do with what's in the frame with you. It's not a murder mystery. It's not somebody stabbing you and going, oh, this is what's happening right now. It's the guy in Act 1 set something down on a table, and in Act 3, 25 years later, that thing is, how come you, blah, 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 blah. There are things in the past. There's decisions you're making right now with your diabetes that are going to affect you in 3 hours or 6 hours. And it's not now so much. Like it's interesting, too, how people overreact to the idea of pre-bolusing originally, because when their blood sugars are out of whack, when they're really first starting to get things together and they're jumping up and down, they're so reactive to everything they see. I did something and then this happened. And I always tell people, if you pre-bolus and 2 minutes later your blood sugar starts dropping, that has nothing to do with the pre-bolus. Nothing. That's why when you guys hear me say Arden's blood sugar was 85 and I pre-bolused her, it's because she was stably 85 for 3 hours. The pre-bolus isn't going to start working right away. I only needed her to get to lunch 10 minutes later.
Right. The only reason it would start working right away is if you physically had that cannula in a vessel.
Yeah, right.
And it was literally going right into the vein.
Pumping it into her bloodstream.
Right.
So in normal situations, which Jenny's bringing up probably because she knows we actually had a pump probably nick a vein in Arden one, and for 2 days we couldn't get our blood sugar to go above like 50 most of the time until we finally just changed her site and everything went back to normal. But that had never happened before. That was crazy. I'm texting Jenny, like, you should have seen the text to Jenny. I sounded like you guys sound when you email me. I was like, I don't know what's happening.
I fed her so much food, and she's at 50.
And I wasn't with her. I was in Florida doing Dancing for Diabetes. My wife's at home going, seriously, this is what's happening when you leave? And I was like, I don't know how to explain any of this. I said, I've looped in Jenny. We're going to figure it out, But anyway, yes. The point is that timing of your basal just as important as the amount of your basal. And to Jenny's point, for those of you who are thinking that basal's in charge of bringing your blood sugar down, it's not. It's in charge of keeping your blood sugar stable. And I say all the time, it's a stupid thing, but do it with me here, unless you're driving. Hold your hands together in front of you, like, in like the classic, prayer
mode
position, right? Imagine your body function and, sugar on one side and your basal on the other side, and they're both pushing each other towards the center. And when nobody wins, right? When your hands don't move to the left or your right, that's a good basal rate. When you start moving towards body function, then your basal's too high. And when your body function starts pushing you away, then your basal's too low. You're trying to just give the basal enough strength to fight off the background things that are happening in your body. Right. And when you eat, a reasonably normal meal, that basal should also, help with your bolus. But don't expect that if you're going to eat like an entire pizza, that your 0.6 basal rate's going to be okay, because it's not. And then, so that's another thing. So once you get done basal testing and figuring out your basal for all your normal times when you're just standing around being you, amazing you, that's one thing. What about your basal insulin while you're eating? And those tests have to happen in real life while you're eating. You have to say to yourself, when I eat a salad with a burger, my blood sugar tries to go up. I wonder what would happen if I did increase my basal rate during that. And, for those of you who've been listening for a long time.
Or after that.
Right. Maybe it's pizza. It doesn't hit me for 90 minutes after I've etten it. Or any other thing, like French fries. Arden had French fries the other night. It must have made her high like 4 hours after she ate them. So
that's just understanding again. That's why we also start with the overnight test, because if you can wake up in target, you are not fighting being too low from excessive insulin dropping you, and you're not fighting being too high and having to correct and add insulin in a time that most people are insulin insensitive in the morning. Right?
Yeah.
So when we talk about things like adding fat in, yes, your background basal, if you know it's solid and set to begin with, then you know how to play with that temporary basal feature to accommodate for long-term impacts like fat. Fat causes essentially a stress factor. It releases triglycerides into the bloodstream, which causes insulin resistance in the aftermath. It can last as long as 10 hours after eating high fat.
Yes.
So most people need a basal increase. It's like fat almost causes your basal insulin dose to be reduced by 50%. So if you're running at a rate of 1.0 overnight and you have this big old awesome like cheese meat lovers pizza at night, you go to bed thinking, man, I nailed that bolus. I'm going to bed beautiful. I'm like a 103. I'm going to sit here all night. It's going to look awesome. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, you're at 300. And you're like, what the heck? Where did this come? It's fat. Usually fat starts to impact by about 3 hours. You get this like drift, and then you get stuck high, and you nail it with insulin, and you nail it with insulin, and you nail it again. And then finally you might start drift down by the time you wake up the next morning. You could have fought it ahead of time by using a temporary rate adjustment. If you know your basal to begin with is set well, you can increase using temporary basal and offset the impact of that fat.
I wonder if I can explain what's in my head correctly. Because when your blood sugar gets elevated, imagine it's 250 coming off of the pizza, and you think, oh, a unit brings me from 250 to 100, so I'll put it in a unit. That's great. But what Jenny just told you was you're at 150% need for your basal. So the unit really just keeps replacing the basal you don't have. So you put the unit in, replaces the basal, keeps you stable at 250, but you still haven't addressed the number. And so then you wait an hour and you go, I can't believe that didn't do anything. And you put in another unit. It doesn't do it again because you're still just replacing the basal. You need to yak up your basal rate and bolus for the number.
Yeah.
And remember that turning up the basal at midnight doesn't mean it's going to start working really maybe until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. So so in the end, let me get very close to the microphone. What you need, and I don't want to oversimplify diabetes, is more insulin. That's what you need. You do not have enough insulin. It's just
you need that T-shirt, guys.
I'm telling you right
insulin.
now. I can't do this podcast forever, people. More insulin if your blood sugar is high. Hey, if your blood sugar is low, guess what? Let me just go at it right now. Less insulin. There you go. It's not difficult, right? It's difficult to imagine the whole thing, which is what this podcast episode's about. Like, we're talking through a number of different scenarios where your basal rate means something. But I think that's it. At the beginning here, Jenny explained a more clinical way to do basal testing. I think if you have a CGM, I tell people when we're speaking privately and they're like, how do I figure out, how much more basal to use? I just go, well, if it's a kid and they're like at 0.3, I'm like, well, turn it to 0.4 and see what happens. And I was like, if they start getting low, put it to 0.35, because your kid's blood sugar's sitting at 200. With 0.3 going in every hour, 0.4 is not going to make them nothing. It just doesn't stand to any reason. Common sense in diabetes is, just like I tell people all the time, one of the best pieces of technology for managing someone with diabetes is text messaging. It is a absolutely pivotal way in how Art and I deal with our blood sugar. If text messaging is a diabetes tool, and in the same way, right, just trying things is a diabetes tool. Like, give it a shot and see what happens. 0.4. Okay, now let's see what happens. Not enough still.
Or even for little kids, even the incremental of the smaller rate pumps, the 0.05 or the 0.025. All of that is an option. It's not on Omnipod, but it is an option on the Tandem and the Medtronic pumps. So that is an option to get smaller incremental adjustments, depending also on what your sensitivity kind of seems to be.
Right.
I think the only thing that we didn't really is the daytime testing. Honestly, daytime means that if you really want to know what's happening behind the meal to make sure that the basal is doing its job, the meal can't be there. Right. So if you wanted to look at morning time, you'd really have to. For adults, you can skip a meal because you can deal with that. You can just, you can slug it out until lunchtime and go ahead and eat your lunch and just see what happens in the morning. When you wake up, fasting blood sugar, you let it sit, you don't bolus, you don't take caffeine, you don't eat anything. You can have water or herbal tea or whatever. Don't go for a 10-mile run either. Look at what happens. For little kids, I usually say, if you can get them to sleep in a little bit longer, maybe on a weekend, at least you're going to get an idea behind what their normal breakfast time is in that morning time to see, did the basal carry them pretty well? Or I had one mother I worked with not too long ago. She's like, he woke up and he just started playing with his Legos right away. He played with his Legos for a long period, didn't even care about eating breakfast. I'm like, awesome. Yeah. That was a basal test. I was like, there was nothing there. There was no food, no bolus. He was sitting and playing with Legos. Fabulous. We've got information. That's
cool. That's excellent. Yeah. Whatever you can do, just, but do it, because you need to know in the end, if you've ever spoken to me privately, what I'll tell you is, in a perfect world, if your basal's right, your blood sugar is going to be 90. It's going to be 85 or 90. Now, I don't expect it to always be that, but that's your goal. And if that's your goal, then when you're at 150, it's not correct. And also, when you're bouncing all over the place, if you're one of those people who right now is struggling and your blood sugar flies all over, you may turn your basal up and get a low blood sugar and think, oh my gosh, that's because I turned my basal up. But it might be about the bolus you used before. So, there's one thing I say all the time that I think is how you start your basal rates. First thing you have to do is find a level. Just find a stability point. It doesn't really almost matter where it is. Just get your blood sugar to sit still. And if you have to nudge with food to do it, or nudge with insulin to do it, it's fine. But get stable somewhere and start over. Even when things go crazy here, I'll say that to Kelly. I'll be like, listen, I said, we're out of, everything's out of whack. We got to find a stable point so we can start over again. And, you just can't, I don't know. It's like trying to catch a bug. You know what I mean? You got to wait till it lands. Anyway. All right. Do you feel like we've covered it?
I think for the most part, yeah.
I think we have to. I appreciate everyone who reached out and asked about a more specific episode about basal testing. This was it. I hope you liked it. Goodbye, Jenny.
Bye.
I want to thank Ascensia Diabetes for sponsoring the Remastered Diabetes Pro Tip series. Don't forget, you can get a free Contour Next Gen Starter Kit at contournext.com/juicebox free meter. While supplies last, U.S. residents only. If you're enjoying the remastered episodes of the Diabetes Pro Tip series from the Juicebox Podcast, you have Touched by Type 1 to thank. TouchedByType1.org is a proud sponsor of the remastering of the Diabetes Pro Tip series. Learn more about them at touchedbytype1.org. A huge thank you to one of today's sponsors, Gvoke Glucagon. Find out more about Gvoke HypoPen at gvokeglucagon.com/juicebox. You spell that GVOKEGLUCAGON.com/juicebox. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Now, listen, there's 26 episodes in this series. You might not know what each of them are. I'm going to tell you now. Episode 1000 is called Newly Diagnosed or Starting Over. Episode 1001, all about MDI. 1002, all about insulin. 1003 is called Pre-Bolus. Episode 1004, Temp Basal. 1005, Insulin Pumping. 1006, Mastering a CGM. 1007, Bump and Nudge. 1008, The Perfect Bolus. 1009, Variables. 1010, Setting Basal Insulin. 1011, Exercise. 1012, Fat and Protein. 1013, Insulin Injury and Surgery. 1014, Glucagon and Low BGs. In episode 1015, Jenny and I talk about emergency room protocols. In 1016, Long-Term Health. 1017, Bump and Nudge Part 2. In episode 1018, Pregnancy. 1019, Explaining Type 1. 1020, Glycemic Index and Load. 1021, Postpartum. 1022, Weight Loss. 1023, Honeymoon. 1024, Female Hormones. And in episode 1025, we talk about transitioning from MDI to pumping. Before I go, I'd like to share 2 reviews with you of the Diabetes Pro Tip series, one from an adult and one from a caregiver. I learned so much from the Pro Tip series when our son was diagnosed last summer. It really helped get me through those first few very tough weeks. It wasn't just your explanations of how it all works, which were way better than anything our diabetes educator told us, but something about the way you and Jenny presented everything, even the scary stuff, that reassured me that we could figure out how to deal with this and to teach our son how to deal with it too. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. This podcast is a game changer. 25 years as a type 1 diabetic, and only now am I learning some of the basics. Scott brings useful information and presents it in digestible ways. Learning that pre-bolus doesn't just mean bolus before you eat, but means timing your insulin so that it is active as the carbs become active, took me already from a decent 6.5 A1C down to a 5.6 in the past 8 months. I've never met Scott, but after listening to hundreds of episodes and joining him in his Facebook group, I consider him a friend. Listening to this podcast and applying it has been the best thing I have done for my health since diagnosis. I genuinely hope that the Diabetes Pro Tip series is valuable for you and your family. If it is, find me in the private Facebook group and say hello. If you're enjoying the Juicebox Podcast, please share it with a friend, a neighbor, your physician, or someone else who you know that might also benefit from the podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the Juicebox Podcast. If you're living with diabetes or are the caregiver of someone who is, and you're looking for an online community of supportive people who understand, check out the Juicebox Podcast private Facebook group, Juicebox Podcast Type 1 Diabetes. There are over 41,000 active members, and we add 300 new members every week. There is a conversation happening right now that would interest you, inform you, or give you the opportunity to share something that you've learned. Juicebox Podcast, Type 1 Diabetes on Facebook. And it's not just for Type 1s. Any kind of diabetes, any way you're connected to it, you are invited to join this absolutely free and welcoming community. Jenny Smith holds a bachelor's degree in human nutrition and biology from the University of Wisconsin. She is a registered and licensed dietitian, a certified diabetes educator, and a certified trainer on most makes and models of insulin pumps and continuous glucose monitoring systems. She's also had type 1 diabetes for over 35 years, and she works at integrateddiabetes.com. If you're interested in hiring Jenny, you can learn more about her at that link.